The moment my parents tried to decide my future in front of a room full of business partners was the exact moment I decided my life would never belong to them again. I was standing in a private dining hall of a luxury hotel, surrounded by people who were smiling politely while studying me like I was part of a contract. My mother kept introducing me with the same carefully practiced sentence, the one she had probably repeated all week while preparing for this evening. My father stood beside her with the calm confidence of someone who believed everything was already settled. Across the table sat another family whose son was apparently supposed to become my husband within the year. No one had asked if I wanted that future. No one had even suggested that I might have other plans. The conversation moving around that table sounded less like a family dinner and more like a negotiation between companies. That was when I realized something important. They weren't asking me to build a life with someone. They were arranging an alliance. What my parents didn't realize was that their carefully planned arrangement was about to collapse in a way none of them could have imagined. Before I continue, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever had someone make a huge decision about your life without even asking you first? And where are you listening from right now? My name is Aria Carter. I'm 32 years old, and today I run a company that negotiates international contracts worth more money than my parents ever expected me to handle. But on that night, standing in that hotel dining room, my parents still saw me as the quiet daughter who would eventually follow the path they had already drawn for her. To understand why that dinner happened at all, we need to go back almost 10 years. I grew up in a house where reputation mattered more than comfort, and success mattered more than happiness. My father built a respectable construction business from the ground up. Over time, it became one of the most recognized companies in our city. He was proud of that achievement, proud of the house it paid for, proud of the connections it brought into our lives. My mother valued those connections just as much. She believed a perfect family was one that looked flawless from the outside. In their version of the future, everything followed a simple plan. I would study business. I would eventually join my father's company. And one day, I would marry someone from the same professional circle so the family network would grow stronger. At least that was the idea. The problem was that it was never the life I wanted. While my parents were planning board meetings and partnerships, I was studying global markets, startups, and international trade. I didn't want to inherit my father's company. I wanted to build something entirely my own. The first time I told them that was during my final year of college. The silence at the dinner table lasted almost a full minute. Then my father leaned back in his chair and said something that would shape everything that followed. "You'll understand later," he said calmly. "Family decisions aren't made alone." At the time, I thought he was talking about my career. I didn't realize he was also talking about my marriage. And 3 years later, that belief led me straight into that hotel dining room, surrounded by people who thought my life was already decided. 3 years after that dinner table conversation, my parents revealed their plan, as if it had always been obvious. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, while sunlight filled the living room and the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. My mother was carefully arranging flowers on the center table, adjusting each stem until it looked perfect. My father sat in his usual chair reviewing emails on his tablet. Nothing about the moment suggested that my entire future was about to be announced like a business decision. "We've been speaking with the Whitman family," my mother said casually, without even looking up from the flowers. "Their son recently returned from London after finishing his graduate program." My father nodded slowly, the same approving nod he used whenever he discussed a promising investment. "Very impressive young man," he added. "Their company has expanded rapidly in the last few years." I had learned to recognize that tone over the years. It was the tone my parents used when they had already made a decision and were simply informing me about it afterward. I placed my coffee cup on the table and looked at them carefully. "And why exactly are you telling me this?" My mother finally looked up and smiled. It was the same warm smile she used whenever she expected me to appreciate something she had arranged. "Because you're meeting them next Friday evening," she said. "It's time you started thinking seriously about your future." The meaning of those words settled in slowly. "You want me to meet their son," I said carefully. My father leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together like someone presenting a very reasonable proposal. "We want you to get to know him," he replied. "Nothing is forced, but both families believe it could be a very beneficial match." Beneficial. The word sounded strange in the context of marriage. "What about what I want?" I asked. For a moment, my father's expression tightened, just slightly. "We've spent decades building relationships that create opportunities for this family," he said. "Sometimes responsibility has to come before preference." I could feel the familiar frustration rising in my chest. The same argument we had circled around for years was starting again. But this time, it wasn't about a job or a company position. This time they were planning my entire personal life. Part of me wanted to argue right there. I wanted to explain that I had my own ambitions and my own path. But experience had already taught me that those conversations usually ended the same way, with my parents insisting they knew what was best. So instead of arguing, I did something that surprised them. I nodded. "All right," I said quietly. "I'll meet them." My mother looked relieved. My father smiled with quiet satisfaction. They thought I had accepted their plan. What they didn't know was that the moment I left the room, I started researching the Whitman family business online. That was when I discovered something interesting. Their company had one major competitor, a fast-growing firm that had been winning several contracts my father had tried to secure over the last few years. My father mentioned that company often during dinner conversations, usually with a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. According to him, the person running that rival company was brilliant, unpredictable, and extremely strategic. Later that evening, while scrolling through an article about an industry conference, I saw a photograph of that rival CEO speaking on stage. Confident, calm, completely in control of the room. At the time, I had no idea that within a few weeks, meeting that person would completely destroy the future my parents had planned, and the dinner with the Whitman family was only the beginning. The dinner with the Whitman family took place at a quiet private restaurant overlooking the river, the kind of place where the lighting was soft and every table felt like it was part of an important meeting. My parents arrived early, just like they always did when they wanted everything to feel perfectly controlled. My mother adjusted the sleeve of my dress before we walked inside, making sure everything looked exactly right. She believed details mattered, especially when other influential families were involved. The Whitmans arrived a few minutes later. They were exactly what my parents expected. Confident, polished, and very aware of the business reputation both families carried. Their son was tall, well-spoken, and clearly used to formal conversations. Within the first 15 minutes, he had already mentioned his graduate degree, his internship experience overseas, and his plans to help expand his family's company into new markets. It all sounded impressive, but it also sounded like a presentation. Every time he spoke, I could feel the direction of the evening becoming clearer. This wasn't a casual introduction. This was a carefully arranged meeting where both families were quietly evaluating whether combining their influence would benefit everyone involved. I listened politely, asking a few questions when it felt appropriate. To anyone sitting nearby, it probably looked like a perfectly successful dinner between two respectable families discussing a promising future. But inside my head, something else was happening. My father leaned slightly toward Mr. Whitman during the main course and lowered his voice just enough to sound confidential. "With the right partnership between our families," he said, "there could be significant opportunities in upcoming development projects." Partnership. Another word that made the entire evening feel less like a personal decision and more like a strategic move. My mother smiled approvingly, clearly pleased with how smoothly everything was unfolding. The Whitmans seemed equally satisfied. Their son even began asking me polite questions about how involved I might eventually become in the family company. That was when something unexpected happened. The restaurant manager approached our table with a professional smile. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said politely, "but someone here recognized Mr. Carter and wanted to say hello." My father looked mildly surprised. "Who is it?" The manager stepped aside. The man standing behind him looked familiar immediately. I had only seen him in photos online before, but there was no mistaking who he was. The CEO of the company my father complained about during nearly every business discussion. The rival who had outbid his firm on multiple major contracts over the past few years. The person my father often described as impossible to predict. He walked toward our table with calm confidence, the kind that made it clear he was comfortable entering a room full of competitors. "Well," he said evenly, extending a hand toward my father. "This is an interesting coincidence." My father stood slowly, clearly surprised. "I didn't realize you dined here." "I had a meeting nearby," the man replied. "Thought I'd stop in." Then his attention shifted briefly toward me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was more like curiosity, like he was trying to understand something about the situation at the table. At that moment, none of us realized how important that small interaction would become. Because within a few weeks, I would make a decision that shocked both families and completely changed the future my parents believed they had already arranged. For the rest of that dinner, my father tried to pretend nothing unusual had happened. The rival CEO exchanged a few polite words, nodded to everyone at the table, and left the restaurant as calmly as he had arrived. But the moment he walked away, the atmosphere had already shifted. My father's shoulders were slightly tense. My mother forced her smile a little too carefully. The Whitman family returned to discussing business expansion, but even they seemed aware that something unexpected had just passed through the room. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about that brief moment when the rival CEO looked at me. It wasn't admiration or judgment. It was curiosity. Almost like he had noticed that I didn't belong in that conversation. By the time the dinner ended, both families were satisfied with how things had gone. My parents believed the meeting had been a success. The Whitmans seemed confident that another meeting would soon follow. My mother talked about future gatherings on the drive home, while my father quietly reviewed possible partnership ideas out loud. They were already building the future they wanted. I spent the ride staring out the window, thinking about something else entirely. The next morning, I did something my parents never expected. I requested a meeting with the one person they least wanted me to speak to. It took a few days before I received a reply, but when it came, it was surprisingly simple. A short email confirming a meeting at a downtown office building. No hesitation, no confusion. Just a time and place. Walking into that building felt strangely calm. The reception area was modern and quiet, filled with large windows and natural light. It felt very different from the traditional offices my father preferred. When I was shown into the conference room, the rival CEO was already there. He stood up as I entered, greeting me with the same calm confidence I remembered from the restaurant. "I was wondering if you'd contact me," he said. That sentence caught me off guard. "You were?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "You looked like the only person at that table who didn't agree with what was happening." For the first time since that dinner, I laughed. "You noticed that quickly." "I noticed negotiations," he replied, and that dinner looked exactly like one. We spoke for almost an hour, not about marriage, not about family expectations, but about business, ambition, and independence. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone was actually listening to what I wanted, instead of telling me what my future should look like. As the meeting was ending, he said something that would change everything. "Your parents are trying to build an alliance," he said thoughtfully. "But alliances only work when both sides choose them." I nodded slowly. That was when the idea fully formed in my mind. If my parents wanted to treat my life like a strategic move in their business world, then maybe I should start playing the game better than they ever expected. 2 weeks later, Both families gathered again for what my parents believed would be the final step before announcing my engagement. They were smiling when I walked into the room, completely unaware that I had already made a very different decision. When I walked into the grand living room that evening, my parents' expressions were a mix of pride and expectation. They had already prepared speeches, small gifts, and polite pleasantries to introduce me to a world I had long felt trapped in. I greeted everyone politely, offering smiles and small talk, all the while hiding the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind. The Whitmans, unaware of the real storm brewing beneath my composed exterior, exchanged glances and seemed impressed by my calm demeanor. Everything appeared perfect, exactly the way my parents had imagined. As the evening progressed, conversations naturally drifted toward family connections, business ventures, and potential engagements. My mother began subtly steering the topic toward me, expecting a nod, a laugh, or perhaps even a hint of excitement for the match they had planned. I let them lead for a moment, watching them bask in the illusion that the outcome was entirely in their control. Then, I chose my moment. I stood up, clearing my throat gently. Actually, I began, letting the words pause just long enough to capture attention. There's something I'd like to share with everyone tonight. The room fell silent, with eyebrows raised in curiosity. I continued, keeping my voice steady and confident. I've given this a lot of thought over the past few weeks, and I've made a decision about my future, one that I hope you'll all respect. I paused, letting the anticipation build. My parents exchanged anxious glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and concern. The Whitmans, though polite, leaned forward slightly, sensing that this was not the expected announcement. I've decided to marry someone, I said, letting the words settle. Someone who understands me, shares my vision, and respects my independence. And yes, I added with a small, almost imperceptible smile, he is the very same person you've all met, the rival CEO. There was a moment of stunned silence. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's hand flew to her mouth in shock. The Whitmans blinked, processing what had just been revealed. A few seconds passed that felt like hours. Then the room erupted, not in anger, but in a flood of mixed reactions: surprise, curiosity, and eventually, reluctant amusement. The rival CEO stepped forward with calm confidence, taking my hand. "It seems we both prefer making our own choices," he said, smiling warmly at the families. "And while we respect each other's businesses, we also respect each other's hearts." As the evening wore on, initial tensions slowly dissolved into laughter, questions, and stories of how life had a way of surprising everyone, even the most meticulous planners. My parents, though hesitant, gradually accepted that my happiness could not be dictated by tradition or strategy alone. The Whitmans, recognizing the audacity and courage it took to make such a choice, offered warm congratulations that were surprisingly genuine. By the end of the night, what began as an intense clash of expectations had transformed into mutual understanding. I finally felt free, not just from my parents' arranged plans, but from the idea that my life had to fit into someone else's template. I had chosen my path, my partner, and my happiness. And as the laughter and conversations carried on into the night, I knew that this story, my story, was just beginning. A story of courage, independence, and the undeniable power of making your own choices. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories on Silent Revenge Lab. You won't want to miss what comes next.